If you're over 70, there are patterns in daily life that separate those who reach 90 and beyond from those who don't. Not dramatic differences, but small, consistent behaviors most people never notice. I've spent decades watching how people age, and what I've learned is that longevity isn't usually about one big decision. It's about quiet choices repeated over years. These aren't things doctors typically mention in a 10-minute appointment, and they're not the kind of advice you'll find on a prescription bottle. But they matter more than most people realize. The interesting thing is, the people who live longest rarely think they're doing anything special. They're not following complex programs or expensive regimens. What they're doing is simpler than that, and it's been hiding in plain sight all along. My name is Harold Bennett, and I've spent most of my adult life working with older adults, not as a doctor, but as someone who pays attention. I've had the privilege of knowing hundreds of people in their 70s, 80s, and 90s, and I've noticed something important. The ones who make it past 90 with their independence intact share certain habits that the others don't. Not all of them, but enough that the pattern is unmistakable. Today, I want to share what I've observed, because I believe it could help you. This isn't about adding years to your life through some miracle discovery. It's about recognizing what actually works, based on real people living real lives. If you'd like more of these conversations, I hope you'll consider subscribing. But right now, I just want you to listen carefully, because what I'm about to tell you isn't complicated, but it is important. Let me start with something I've seen again and again. The first thing I notice about people who live past 90 is how they move throughout the day. I'm not talking about exercise programs or gym memberships. I'm talking about something much simpler. They don't stay still for long stretches. I knew two women, both 73 when I met them. Margaret lived alone in a small house with a garden. Susan lived in a similar house just 3 streets over. Both were widows, both retired from teaching, both in what their doctors called good health. But there was a difference in how they spent their days, and that difference mattered more than anyone guessed at the time. Margaret would get up in the morning and make her bed, then walk to the kitchen to make breakfast. After eating, she'd wash the dishes by hand instead of using the dishwasher. Mid-morning, she'd go outside to check on her tomatoes or pull a few weeds. She'd come back in, rest for a bit, then get up to make lunch. In the afternoon, she might walk to the mailbox at the end of her street, fold some laundry, or straighten up the living room. Nothing strenuous, just small movements throughout the day. She was always getting up and doing something, even if it was just walking to another room to water a plant. Susan, on the other hand, would settle into her recliner after breakfast with the remote control and her phone within reach. She'd sit there reading or watching television until lunch, then return to the same spot afterward. She wasn't lazy. She just didn't see any reason to move around when she was comfortable. By evening, she'd realized she'd barely stood up all day except to use the bathroom and fix meals. 10 years later, Margaret was still living independently at 83, still tending her garden, still moving through her house with steady steps. Susan had experienced 2 serious falls, lost significant muscle strength, and needed help with daily activities. She moved into assisted living at 81, not because of a disease, but because her body had quietly forgotten how to keep her balanced and strong. What I learned from watching Margaret and others like her is this: your body at 70 doesn't forgive long periods of stillness the way it did at 40. When you sit for 3 or 4 hours straight, your muscles begin to weaken, your balance systems start to falter, and your circulation slows in ways that add up over time. But when you move every hour, even just for 5 minutes, your body remembers how to stay functional. This may sound simple, but it matters more than you think. The people who make it past 90 tend to build small movements into their day naturally. They don't think of it as exercise. They just have reasons to get up: a plant to water on the other side of the house, stairs they choose to climb instead of avoid, dishes they wash by hand because they like the routine. They're teaching their bodies to keep working without even realizing it. The second pattern I've noticed is how people who live longest approach food, and it's not what you might expect. They don't follow strict diets or cut out entire food groups. What they do is much simpler. They stop eating before they're completely full. I remember Joe and Frank, both 76, who used to meet at the same diner every Saturday morning. Both ordered similar meals: eggs, toast, maybe some bacon. But there was a difference in how they finished. Joe would eat until his plate was clean, sometimes even mentioning he was uncomfortably full. He'd been raised to finish everything in front of him, and that habit stayed with him. Frank, on the other hand, would eat slowly, and when he felt satisfied, he'd put his fork down even if food remained. He'd take the leftovers home without any guilt about waste. Over the years, Joe's weight gradually increased. Not dramatically, but enough that his knees started bothering him, his energy decreased, and his doctor began mentioning concerns about his blood sugar. Frank stayed lean without trying. He rarely felt sluggish after meals, and his health markers remained stable year after year. By their mid-80s, Joe was dealing with multiple health issues that limited his independence. Frank was still living on his own, still going to that same diner, still leaving food on his plate when he'd had enough. Research tells us that people in cultures where longevity is common practice something called hara hachi-biyu, eating until you're about 80% full. But you don't need to know the term to understand the principle. Your stomach takes about 20 minutes to signal your brain that you're satisfied. If you eat quickly or until you're stuffed, you've already gone past what your body actually needed. The people I've known who reach 90 seem to have an instinct for this. They eat slowly enough to notice when they've had enough. They don't deprive themselves, but they also don't push past the point of satisfaction just because food is there. This habit, practiced over decades, keeps their weight stable and reduces the strain on their hearts, joints, and organs. It's not about being perfect at every meal. It's about listening to your body more often than ignoring it. I hope this is making sense so far. These aren't dramatic changes, but they're the ones that seem to matter most. The third thing I've observed is about sleep, but not in the way you might think. The people who live past 90 don't necessarily sleep longer than others. What they do is keep a consistent schedule, even when they don't have to. Carol and Nancy were both retired nurses, both 74, both living alone. Carol had worked night shifts for years and loved the freedom of retirement. She could finally stay up as late as she wanted and sleep in every morning. Some nights, she'd be awake until 2 a.m. watching movies. Other nights, she'd fall asleep at 10 p.m. She'd wake up whenever her body decided, sometimes at 7 a.m., sometimes at 11. She liked the flexibility. Nancy, despite being retired, still went to bed around 10:30 each night and woke up at 6:30 each morning. Not because she had to, but because it felt right to her. Her body seemed to expect it. Even on weekends, even on holidays, her rhythm stayed mostly the same. What I noticed over time was that Carol often seemed tired, even after sleeping 9 or 10 hours. She'd mention feeling foggy in the mornings, having trouble focusing, feeling irritable without knowing why. She developed problems with her blood pressure that her doctor struggled to control. Nancy, sleeping 7 to 8 hours on a regular schedule, seemed more alert, more steady in her mood, and her health markers remained remarkably stable. Doctors have noticed that irregular sleep patterns stress the body in ways that regular sleep doesn't. Your heart, your hormones, even your immune system all function better when they can predict when rest is coming. When you go to bed at wildly different times, your body never fully settles into a healthy rhythm. Over years and decades, that irregular pattern wears on you. The people who make it past 90 tend to honor their body's need for routine. They might not sleep perfectly every night, but they go to bed around the same time and wake up around the same time, giving their body the gift of predictability. It's a small thing that compounds over years into better health and sharper minds. The fourth pattern is about relationships, and this one might be the most important of all. People who live past 90 almost always have someone they talk to regularly, not just casual conversation, but real connection. I think about Robert and Walter, both 77, both widowers. Robert had children who lived out of state. They called occasionally, but he spent most of his days alone. He'd go to the grocery store, maybe exchange pleasantries with the cashier, then return home. Days would pass where he didn't have a real conversation with anyone. He told himself he was fine with solitude, that he didn't need people the way others did. Walter also lived alone, but he'd made it a habit to call his brother every Tuesday evening, just to talk, about nothing important, really. The weather, something he'd seen on the news, a memory from their childhood. 20 minutes, maybe 30. He also joined a group of men who met at the library every Thursday morning to play chess. Not tournament chess, just friendly games with conversation in between moves. He saw the same people every week. They knew each other's stories. What I observed was that Robert's decline seemed to accelerate in ways that weren't purely physical. He became more withdrawn, less interested in things, more forgetful. His thinking seemed to slow. Walter, on the other hand, stayed sharp and engaged well into his late 80s. His memory remained strong, his curiosity intact, his mood generally positive. Studies have shown that social isolation affects your health as much as smoking or obesity, but I didn't need studies to see it. I watched it happen. When you have regular, meaningful connection with others, your mind stays active, your stress levels decrease, and you have reasons to take care of yourself. When you're isolated, everything becomes harder. Your motivation fades. Your sense of purpose weakens. The people who live longest aren't necessarily extroverts or social butterflies, but they have someone, a friend they meet for coffee, a sibling they call weekly, a group they belong to, even if it's small. They've made connection a regular part of their life, not something they'll get around to eventually. If you're finding this helpful, I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments. Let me talk about the fifth thing I've noticed. People who make it past 90 tend to have something they do that gives them a sense of purpose, even if it's small. I knew Eleanor and Barbara, both 75, both retired from similar office jobs. Eleanor felt lost after retirement. She'd spent 40 years going to work every day, and suddenly there was nothing she had to do. She'd watch television, do some cleaning, maybe read a book. But when you asked her what she was looking forward to, she didn't have an answer. She was waiting for something to fill the time, but nothing came. Barbara, on the other hand, started volunteering at a local elementary school, helping children practice reading one afternoon a week. It wasn't much, just 2 hours on Thursdays. But it gave her a reason to set her alarm on Wednesday nights. She'd think about which book she'd bring, which child might need extra encouragement. Those 2 hours made her feel needed, and that feeling carried through the rest of her week. Over the years, Eleanor's health declined in ways that seemed connected to her lack of purpose. She developed depression that her doctor struggled to treat. She stopped taking care of herself with the same attention. She'd forget to take her medications, skip meals, let her house fall into disarray. Barbara stayed engaged and active. She took care of herself because she wanted to be there for those Thursday afternoons. She had a reason. What I've learned is that purpose doesn't have to be grand. It doesn't have to change the world. You don't need to start a charity or write a book. You just need something that makes you feel like you matter, something that gives structure and meaning to your time. It could be caring for a garden, calling to check on a friend who lives alone, making quilts for a homeless shelter, teaching someone a skill you have. The specifics don't matter as much as the feeling that you're contributing something, that your presence makes a difference. The people who live past 90 have found that something. It gives them a reason to wake up with intention instead of just passing time until the day ends. The sixth thing I want to talk about is how people who live longest deal with change and difficulty. They don't pretend problems don't exist, but they also don't let setbacks define them. I remember meeting two men at a community center, both 78, both dealing with significant health challenges. Thomas had been diagnosed with diabetes and needed to make changes to his diet and lifestyle. He was angry about it. He felt betrayed by his body, frustrated that he couldn't eat the foods he loved, resentful of the medications and monitoring. He'd complain to anyone who'd listen about how unfair it was, how his life had been ruined. Richard received a similar diagnosis around the same time. He was disappointed, certainly, but his response was different. He told me, "Well, this is what I'm dealing with now. I guess I'll figure out how to manage it." He learned about his condition, adjusted his meals, checked his blood sugar as required, and then got on with his life. He didn't dwell on it or let it become his entire identity. 5 years later, Thomas's health had deteriorated significantly, partly because his anger and resistance made it hard for him to follow through with care. Richard was managing his diabetes well and living actively. The diagnosis hadn't changed. What changed was how they carried it. This may sound simple, but it matters more than you think. Life after 70 brings changes and challenges that you can't avoid. Your body won't work exactly the way it used to. You'll face losses and limitations. The people who make it past 90 don't pretend these things aren't hard, but they also don't let bitterness take root. They adapt. They find ways to work with their new reality instead of fighting against it constantly. I'm not saying you should never feel frustrated or sad about what you've lost. Those feelings are human and valid. But the people who live longest seem to move through those feelings instead of setting up camp in them. They grieve what's changed, then they turn their attention to what they can still do, what still brings them joy, what's still worth their energy. The seventh and final thing I've observed might surprise you. People who live past 90 tend to spend time outside almost every day, even if it's just for a few minutes. I think of Helen and Dorothy, both 80, both living in the same apartment building. Helen's routine included a morning walk to the corner and back, rain or shine. Just 5 or 10 minutes, nothing strenuous. She'd feel the air on her face, notice the seasons changing, watch the neighborhood wake up. Dorothy preferred to stay inside where it was comfortable and controlled. She'd look out her window, but rarely stepped outside unless she had a specific errand. Over time, Helen maintained better balance, better mood, better sleep. Dorothy became more fragile, more anxious, more prone to falls when she did venture out. The difference wasn't dramatic. Helen wasn't running marathons. She was just going outside regularly, exposing herself to natural light, moving her body in open space, breathing fresh air. Natural light helps regulate your sleep cycle and your mood in ways that indoor lighting can't replicate. Fresh air and gentle movement support your circulation and balance. Even the simple act of navigating uneven sidewalks or slight inclines keeps your body adaptable. These small exposures add up over years and to maintain strength and stability. The people who make it past 90 don't treat the outdoors as something to endure on the way to their car. They see it as part of their daily life. A short walk, sitting on the porch, tending to plants in the yard, working in the garden. Nothing extreme, just regular, gentle contact with the world outside their walls. Let me bring all of this together, because I know I've covered a lot of ground. What I've observed over decades is that the people who live past 90 share certain quiet habits. They move throughout the day instead of staying still for hours. They eat until they're satisfied instead of stuffed. They keep a consistent sleep schedule. They maintain real connections with others. They have something that gives them purpose. They adapt to change without letting bitterness take root. And they spend a little time outside most days. None of these things alone will guarantee a long life. But together, practiced consistently over years, they create a foundation that supports both longevity and independence. The good news is that these aren't complicated or expensive. You don't need special equipment or professional supervision. You just need to make small adjustments to how you live your daily life. I want you to think about your own patterns, not to judge yourself, but just to notice. Which of these habits are already part of your life? Which ones might be worth bringing in, even in small ways? You don't have to change everything at once. In fact, I'd encourage you not to. Pick one area that resonates with you and start there. Maybe it's getting up and moving around once an hour. Maybe it's calling a friend or family member once a week. Maybe it's stepping outside for 5 minutes every morning. Small changes, repeated consistently, become the patterns that shape how you age. You're not too old to start. Your body still responds to how you treat it. Your mind still benefits from connection and purpose. Your future still holds possibility. If you know someone who might benefit from hearing this, I hope you'll share it with them. And if you'd like more of these conversations about living well in your later years, please consider subscribing. I'm here because I believe these years matter, and I believe you deserve to live them with strength, dignity, and independence. Thank you for listening. I'd love to hear your thoughts on what I've shared today.